Hello, welcome to Remember the Film, the podcast where there are certain rules one must abide by in order to successfully survive a horror movie. My name's Josh Bradley. I'm joined by my co-host, Jeff Skeet Ulrich.
Oh, no.
And Hugo Panay. What's up, Hugo?
Hello, doing good. How about you?
I'm good, especially because we're delighted on the podcast to be joined today by a very special guest, first-time guest, one of my favorite people, Katie Bradley. Hi, Katie.
Hi, Josh. Happy to be here.
Katie Bradley? That name sounds familiar.
Someone do the Borat voice for me.
My wife.
That's it. Except she's my wife.
So
but
your
yes.
wife.
Katie and I are married. Happy anniversary, babe, this past week.
Thank you so
Oh,
much.
nice.
Happy to be here, guys.
I hope this wasn't
awesome.
your first time saying happy anniversary.
He just
was
now
not.
remembered. He's like, oh, shit, right. God,
Save it for the podcast.
I was not on the pod last week because we were in Hawaii, and that's why. So, happy times. Katie is the biggest Scream fan I know, so I'm really excited to talk about Scream in general, but especially excited to talk about Scream with Katie. So, if it's okay with you guys, let's just get right into it. Yeah?
Yep.
Let's get into it.
Jazzed. Okay, let's do it. Scream, written by Kevin Williamson, directed by Wes Craven. The kernel of the idea for the movie for Williamson was the Gainesville Ripper, who was a real-life serial killer who killed 5 college students over the course of 4 days in August of 1990. R.I.P. to all those people. That killer was caught, by the way. It was not like there was someone on the loose when he wrote the script. But he originally wrote an 18-page treatment about a girl alone in a house that's taunted by a killer over the phone, which ultimately became, the opening scene of Scream. And after he had that short story, basically, he apparently was in, financial straits in the 90s, so he said, I'm going to just try to write something that can sell quickly to pay my bills. So he locked himself in a room in Palm Springs and expanded his 18-page short into a full-length feature. And apparently it only took him 3 days to do so, which just
That's
makes
crazy.
makes me furious.
Pretty good clip on writing a whole screenplay.
Said I could write a really bad script in 3 days, but
Yeah.
to write a script this good in 3 days is
That's the
something
impressive
else. And
part.
Just
Because,
again,
it's not bad. If you hadn't told me it only took 3 days, I would never have guessed that, because this screenplay is pretty solid.
I think it's tight. Yeah, it's
It's
tight
more
and
than pretty
taut.
solid.
Yeah,
It's a magnum opus.
I mean, that probably is true in the case of Ken Williamson. All due respect to the guy, this is a great magnum opus. I'm not disparaging anything. So the script sparked a bidding war among multiple studios, eventually coming down to the 2 finalists in the bidding war were Oliver Stone and Dimension Films, which was an arm of Miramax at the time, and Dimension won, which I'm happy about because Oliver Stone, I like a lot of his movies, but I feel like he's like a dice roll every time he makes a movie, and it's easy to say in hindsight Dimension should have won because they made this movie and this movie rules, so I'm glad Dimension won. The title of the movie, do you guys know the original title of the movie while it was the original title of the script and the working title while in production?
I saw this while I was watching the trivia on Amazon
It was
Prime
Scary
came up.
Movie.
Yeah, Scary Movie.
It was Scary Movie, which, of course, would eventually be used for the parodies. Which is ironic, because this is already a parody, so the parody of the parody eventually was called what this was going to be called in the first place.
I also love the Scary Movie films, so maybe that gives some insight into what my taste is in movies, because I freaking love those movies as well.
Apparently Bob Weinstein was the one who suggested the title change from Scary Movie to Scream, and Wes Craven and Kevin Williamson didn't like it, but Bob Weinstein pays the bills, I guess.
Yeah.
And they didn't change it until the movie was pretty much done filming. And I didn't notice that till the most recent watch, but the last line of the movie before it cuts to black is someone
Courtney
saying
Cox.
this refers to a scary movie, basically.
This is like something out of a scary movie.
Yeah, exactly. But
And they also say
Hugo,
it multiple times during the script, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, but that's
We'll
the
get to
moment that feels like they're saying the title of a movie.
Yeah, it's underlined and bolded in the script, I bet, and hey, the title.
We did it.
But I think Hugo just said that the Dimension Films, the Weinstein arm of the Weinstein company, would eventually make Scary Movie 4 years later. So maybe they took the idea of having a light satire called Scary Movie, and then just pushing to a full blown parody and making that movie 4 years later, which again became very popular. So it was released December 20th, 1996. Why was it released in December? Because the studio thought it could be good counter-programming for the family movies at Christmas time. And it had a budget of 15 million. Box office worldwide 173 million, domestic 103 million against a 15 million budget. So it was a big success, but not immediately. Go ahead, Grizz.
Do you know how much of that budget went to Drew Barrymore?
I would think
that's an interesting question.
Little.
I would hope it was a little, given her like her actual screen time in the movie. But like, part of me thought like that because they kind of build her as a big part of the movie in the marketing for it. Mm-hmm. So I would have assumed that she must have been paid pretty well for it.
And in the end credits, she gets an A&D Drew Barrymore. It's like it's this person, this one, and Drew Barrymore. That's usually like a special credit that you have to negotiate for. I don't know if it comes with more pay necessarily, but Katie, what do you got?
She was initially signed on to be the lead of this movie. So, and then apparently she requested that she kind of wanted to subvert the genre and surprise everything and like be killed off right away. So I think initially she was going to be the Neve Campbell, which is kind of crazy to think about what this franchise would look like with like a 50-year-old Drew Barrymore who now has like a talk show host. I don't know. The whole thing just seems kind of crazy to wrap my mind around.
There probably wouldn't be a fifth one if it was Drew Barrymore in the lead role, I would think.
No. Yeah, the series would probably look a lot different, but I would imagine that's why she's getting that credit, because they wanted her on board as the star, and maybe she just says, let's dial this back, but still give me that recognition.
Which I thought, and we may have this in the outline later, but first of all, Drew Barrymore, as we just alluded, dies in the opening scene. This movie's 25 years old. I feel like that's not really a spoiler at this point. Yeah, no. I would think.
Also, I think anything that happens in the first 10 minutes of a movie doesn't count as a spoiler.
Yeah, I agree. Even people who haven't seen Scream have probably might have seen this opening on YouTube or whatever, or have an idea of what happens at the beginning at least.
But it's interesting that like she is the biggest name in the movie. She's killed off quickly, which I thought was maybe an homage to Psycho, possibly, because Janet Leigh was the biggest star in that, and she was killed in the first 40 minutes in the first half, basically. So
yeah,
I don't know. So I just mentioned the box office, 15 million budget, 173 worldwide, 103 domestic, and I asked you guys to let me vamp for a few minutes in the box office. So
vamp away.
This is that vamping. Please chime in whenever you see fit. First question: are you guys familiar with the term multiplier in regard to box office?
I've heard the term. I can't say that I fully remember.
It's sort of a way to calculate how much a movie makes. Isn't it like how much it makes compared to its opening weekend? So it's sort of a calculator of how much the movie makes in its opening weekend compared to how it makes overall.
It's basically a measure of how much legs a movie has at the box office. Like what's its total domestic gross relative to its opening weekend? How much money did it make during its opening weekend compared to the whole thing? And so like modern movies, I think modern movies in today's box office climate, between 2.5 and 3.5 is a pretty typical multiplier. And I pulled some numbers for like some recent hits. I happened to use 2018 just as a number. So like Venom from 2018, the sequel of which is now in theaters, big hit. It made 80 million opening weekend, on its way to 213 domestic. So its multiplier was 2.7, which again is pretty typical. And that was a big hit. Infinity War made 258 on its opening weekend, which still doesn't feel like a real number, on its way to making 679 domestic. So that was a 2.6 multiplier. And then you look at like a movie in today's box office climate that actually has legs. That was a big word of mouth hit, like Get Out, which opened in a box office dead zone in February. No one had any expectations for it. It made 33 million its opening weekend, which is better than anyone's thinking it would. But then it just like kept making money. So it opened to 33 on its way to 176. So its multiplier was 5.3, which, for today's environment is huge.
It's pretty high.
Scream multiplier was 16.3. It only opened to 6 million. It debuted at number 4 at the box office. And so immediately the studio is like, oh well, we tried. It's not going to do anything because it opened at number 4 at only 6 million. But then its second week, it made more than its first week. Its third week, it made more than its second week. And so like it never got above number 3 at the box office, but just like it just kept making money. Word of mouth is really good. People just kept going to see it and ended up having a long, like I think it was a 22-week run from December into it closed in May. So it just kept going.
God, that feels impossible today.
Yeah. What's up, Chris?
Is that something that you think like, is it happens more within the horror genre where they have a weak opening weekend and then the word of mouth carries a horror movie? Because like I feel like horror fans, they talk to each other all the time about new horror movies. Like, should I watch this? Is it any good? I see our friends talk about this all the time. I wonder if, if that's a more common thing with horror movies or not. Did you happen to look at like Nightmare on Elm Street or, Halloween or anything like that?
I didn't. I looked at other movies in 1996 just to get like a give us a baseline, and I'll share those in a minute. But I don't know. That's an interesting thought, though. Like, I don't know. I feel like horror movies, they all have kind of a built-in audience because there are some people there are some horror fans who will see any horror movie that's released in theaters.
Yeah, so they got a solid baseline.
They have a solid baseline, and I don't know. I guess maybe some of those kind of trickle down, from the horror fans, hardcore people into, normal people. Me and Katie saw Get Out in theaters. I feel like that's not usually the kind of movie I would go to in theaters, but I just heard it was great. So, word of mouth is a real thing.
I don't normally watch horror movies much at all.
Same.
But I've now seen Scream twice, and that was on recommendation that, no, Jeff, you'll probably actually really like this. And, I do.
To that, I guess.
Jeff, to your point about kind of like pulling comps or figuring out other multipliers for horror movies, I feel like that's tough to do for this because Scream is kind of incomparable to me. I think it is so its own thing. It's a hybrid of a true horror movie and a parody and so many other things that while you were talking, I was trying to think, okay, well, what other horror movies were there in the mid-90s and what did that look like? And I was like, I actually don't know and I don't really care because Scream is its own thing. And to me, it just kind of stands alone in its genre. So,
I kind of agree.
It really did something.
We'll get to that in a minute, because you're kind of touching on something, how it's like a slash movie, but also a commentary on slash movies, and that's my favorite thing about it, but we'll get to that. As I said, I pulled some comps from 1996 just to like give us a better baseline, because like I said, currently in today's theater environment, 2.5 to 3.5 is a pretty typical multiplier, but back in the 90s it was a little different. So the 4 highest grossing movies of 1996, the year Scream came out, Independence Day had a 6.1 multiplier. Twister was the number 2 movie of the year. Can you believe that?
I can believe it, but that bums me out a little bit.
Twister had a 5.9 multiplier. Mission Impossible, only 4. And The Rock, the Michael Bay movie, had a 5.4. So let's say that in 1996, 4 to 6 was probably a more typical multiplier. And now it's like 2.5 to 3.5. But again, Scream, 16. It's insane.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ask me, not right now, but ask me someday about my Big Fat Greek Weddings multiplier, because it will blow your pants off. So 16 multiplier, it was a big hit. No one expected it, but it was. So obviously they start looking to sequels, and Kevin Williamson, when he wrote his original spec script for Scream, looking to sell it, he also wrote a 5-page treatment for a potential sequel, and then another 5-page treatment for a potential second sequel. And he was hoping that would like increase interest in his script if, the franchise potential was there. So I believe they put Scream 2 into production while Scream was still in theaters. And he expanded that 5-page treatment very quickly. And
if it was in theaters for that long, like they pretty much had to have started the production for the second one.
Well, yes, especially because here's one of my favorite bits of trivia. Scream 2 is the only sequel I can think of that is not based on previous IP that came out less than a year after its predecessor. Because Scream came out December 20, 96. Scream 2 came out December 12, 97. So it was like 50 weeks later. And I'm like, damn, that's crazy.
Nuts. I mean, maybe James Bond did that at the beginning in the 60s, but other than that, I can't.
That's also based on IP, though. That's based on books.
That's true. That is based on books, yeah.
It's just based on Kevin Williamson, Mm-hmm. And also, like, we can get to this. I think Scream 2 is great. So, like, the fact that they had, like, this really good movie just locked in the chamber that they made in, like, a few months, I think is really impressive. So Scream 2 was also a big hit. Scream 1 made $173 million worldwide box office. Scream 2 made $172 million. So it made $1 million less than Scream 1, which is great return on investment. Yeah. So we had Scream in 96, Scream 2 in 97, Scream 3 in 2000, 3 years later, Scream 4 in 2011, so 11 years later, and now we have Scream, air quotes, Scream 5, because apparently it's just called Scream again for some reason.
Because that's what horror franchises do.
That's true. which
you just go back to just calling it whatever it was.
They know what they're doing. They know exactly what they're doing. But that's coming out in January, February, I want to say. But
January.
Yeah, coming out.
Okay,
but it's definitely 2022. So it'll be another 11 years.
And we just had a trailer drop for the first time this past week as we're recording this, which I think looks great, and I'm really excited for it. So I guess me and Katie are the only two people who have seen all 4 Scream movies. Is that right?
Yep, correct.
Okay, so I wanted to ask you guys your ranking.
Scream 1, number 1.
I mean, I've been really wanting to watch the sequels, but for some reason it never really happened. I don't know why. I think last year I was going on a big... Why?
Because I had heard that they weren't very good.
Oh no, I'd heard they're still, fun and
I heard that they like Scream 2 was pretty good, and then Scream 3 was not as good, and then they got progressively worse. Is that not the case?
Well, you got a couple people you can ask right here.
I know, so I'm asking.
There you go. So what are your rankings?
Well, yeah, let's do it. Katie, rank the 4 Scream movies and give your 10-second take on each one.
Sure. So I think the OG is undoubtedly the best. It is going to go slightly downhill from there. I don't like Scream 2 as much as most people. So for me, for most of my life, I would have told you Scream, Scream 3, Scream 2, Scream 4. Recently, I've had a little bit of kind of a renaissance on Scream 2. I would say they're maybe tied. So 2 and 3, maybe neck and neck for me. I didn't like Scream 4 as much. I think my opinions are not so popular, as Josh can differ from me, but I would say definitely hang with the original trilogy, and then the expectations for kind of the reboot from 2011 I think are a little bit different because they kind of modernize things a bit. But there's definitely some great parts in all of them, but I think all the original trilogy is really worth watching.
I have another question. I don't know if you want to do your rankings first, though, Josh.
Go for it.
My question is, this first one is so much about subverting the tropes of previous horror movies. How do they continue to do that in sequels?
Well, the sequel is a lot about, horror sequels. They're in college, and in the second one they're in college, and, Randy, the Jamie Kennedy character in this, is in a film class, and, there's several scenes of, him discussing sequels with his classmates, and,
of course.
So, in this, he talks about how to survive a horror movie. Well, in the sequel, he talks about, the tropes of the horror sequels, and, what you have to do to survive that movie, etc. So, they definitely play with it.
My worry, and one of the reasons why I didn't, go on, because aside from hearing that they weren't as good, was I thought there's just no way that they can, make a franchise out of something that is supposed to be subverting what you would come to expect from horror movies when they are in fact creating what we expect from horror movies in the future.
Well, even in the opening scene, Drew Barrymore says the killer on the phone, she thought Nightmare on Elm Street was great, but all the sequels sucked. Even make a joke to that in this movie in the first 3 minutes. And even in the 2011 Scream 4, that is all about rebooting horror franchises, and I won't. That's kind of, you can get into spoiler territory quickly, but that's the killer's motivation, for example, is rebooting rebooting the previous murders from 10 years ago, basically.
Right.
It's good. So my ranking, I think, as Katie alluded, I think maybe I haven't really looked into how popular these are with people, but I don't know. I feel like mine's the more normie take, and Katie's is more her own. I think it's Scream 1, Scream 2, Scream 4, Scream 3. And, for me, 1, 2, and 4 are excellent, and Scream 3 is, okay. But, my take is that, these movies are, very clever and very winky. And, as I said earlier, they're slasher movies, but also commentary on slasher movies, satire of slasher movies at times. But, in 1 and 2, they definitely are in on the joke, and it's all like I said, it's all winky, and it's kind of ridiculous, but it walks the line between ridiculous and scary. And I think in Scream 3 it just kind of tips over into ridiculous. That's just my take on Scream 3. But I as I told Katie off mic, because we live together, I do need to rewatch Scream 3 for sure, and I need to rewatch Scream 2 for that matter. I feel like we randomly watched Scream 4 earlier this year, and Scream 4 is good. I think it's really good. So
I would like to add a point. I was going to say in defense of Scream 3, but it's really just to trash Scream 2 a little bit. This is not a major plot point spoiler. But in defense of my ranking Scream 2 a little lower, there is an entire scene that is not a joke, that one character gets on a table in the cafeteria and sings I Think I Love You by David Partridge to another character. And everyone in the cafeteria is clapping and smiling and nodding. And it's not really tongue-in-cheek. It's meant to be like a nice moment. And I think that could be in the middle of Chinatown. And I would be like, that movie was horrible. Because that brought it down so much.
I love that she picked Chinatown as well. Yeah. That's great.
I did.
Great pick.
So I would just say go into Scream 2 and just prepare. Steel yourselves for that. Great movies, but I don't think I've ever been able to get past that as far as kind of how I would rank it with the others.
Last thing on Scream 2, and then we move on to actually talking about our film to remember. I didn't know this until doing the research for this episode, but Scream 2, they rushed in production, obviously, and apparently the script leaked online, which I didn't know was a thing that could happen in 1997, but it did. And the killer's identities were revealed online. So, they actually had to do pretty extensive rewrites, basically, right before production, even during production. Apparently, they were finishing writing scenes the day they were shot, for example.
Oh, wow.
And that included Kevin Williamson, shuffling around who the killer was, too. And just to, keep audiences guessing, particularly the ones who had read the spoilers online. And this is not a spoiler, but if you watch the end of Scream 2 for the killer reveal scene, in Scream 1 the killer reveal happens and okay, that's it, that's the killer. In Scream 2 the killer reveal, they really, really draw it out where it still could be this person or this person. It's a very extended tight sequence, and I don't know, knowing that backstory makes I think the killer reveal in Scream 2 a lot more fun. Grizz, what do you got?
I just picture some horror nerd sitting at his computer and then yelling at his mom to get off the phone. Get off the phone, Mom! I'm trying to download who the killer is for Scream 2.
It's a 10 megabyte file. It'll take me 5 hours.
One last thing to add on that point. So everything Josh just said about them having to write multiple versions, that then became a plot point in Scream 3. This is not a major spoiler, but that's something that they wrote into the movie, that they were like, okay, well, and again, this is not a major spoiler about the movie, but in Scream 3, it is about a movie being made about past murders. So it's basically, the murders of Scream 2 are being made into a movie in Scream 3. And they write that in. So I think that's just another one of the ways that the film continues to kind of wink at itself and be like, oh, it could be anyone because we don't know who's going to get killed next in the script because there's a bunch circulating. It's kind of fun.
Scream 3 really gets up its own ass, but I think in a good way. It's fun.
Isn't that kind of similar to New Nightmare as well? I'm not sure if you've seen that one, but apparently that's really meta, where the protagonist of the first Nightmare on Elm Street movie is playing the actress who was that character, but also she ends up being that character. There's sort of weird shenanigans.
So that's a good segue. You just brought up New Nightmare. So I want to talk about Wes Craven in general and slasher movies in general. Because again, Wes Craven directed this, and this movie is credited as revitalizing the slasher genre. Scream is. So I don't know a ton about Wes Craven's work because I have, I'm not a horror guy, so I haven't seen a lot of his stuff. But I would maybe say that I think he might be the definitive slasher director. And as I put in the outline here, I think that in my mind the two definitive slasher movies are Psycho and Halloween, but Hitchcock and John Carpenter did not do exclusively horror. Hitchcock did a lot of thrillers and mysteries and even romances, and John Carpenter did a lot of action movies and that kind of thing. But Wes Craven kind of only did this kind of movie, I feel like. The big
specifically slashers as well.
I would throw Friday the 13th into the slasher icons as well, at least for the first movie.
Who did Friday the 13th?
I always forget.
Somebody else.
Seen it, but it wasn't Wes Craven.
Right. But Wes Craven did Last House on the Left, The Hills Have Eyes, which isn't really slasher, but kind of slasher adjacent. A Nightmare on Elm Street, as we just mentioned. The People Under the Stairs. And I think it's probably fair to say that his career was kind of in a downturn, as was the slasher movie in general, kind of in a downturn in the late 80s, early 90s. And that's why Scream came along and revitalized it. And Kevin Williamson, kind of wanted to do commentary about how the slasher genre is dying by making a slasher, winking at the fact that genre is dying. What do you got, Grizz?
It was Sean S. Cunningham was the name of the director of Friday the 13th. He didn't direct any of the other Friday movies, so...
I wonder what kind of career he went on to have, because I've never heard of him.
It wasn't good. Looking at his letterboxd, it wasn't good.
think the time when Scream came out was very much the time of getting a bunch of terrible horror sequels. Like, we were getting bad Alien sequels, we were getting bad Predator sequels, we were getting, bad Halloween sequels, Friday the 13th. All the horror franchises were just getting more and more boring sequels that nobody liked. And so putting this film out at that time, I think, is pretty perfect.
Yes. And I want to talk about that exact point in a second, but I just want to ask you guys what Wes Craven movies you've seen. I have not seen many, as I said.
Yeah, I've only seen Scream and Nightmare on Elm Street, but
Same for me.
I'm very interested in seeing the sequels to this, but I just somehow never did. I think I'm going to do that this week, to be honest.
I was actually feeling kind of the same thing, Hugo. I was like, well, maybe in the lead up to Halloween, like, I'm not going to watch as many horror movies as I did last year, but I could probably knock out the Scream franchise. I can do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he directed all 4 Screams, and he passed in 2015, RIP, but so he's not doing Scream 5. But so of his movies, I've seen the 4 Screams. I just saw Nightmare on Elm Street like 3 days ago for the first time, and I kind of want to talk about that. And I saw Red Eye in theaters when I was like 15, the Rachel McAdams, Cillian Murphy movie.
Yeah,
which
I was going to say Cillian Murphy was in that, and he
actually
looked
really good.
He looked very terrifying in the trailers for that.
Yes. I guess I just swallowed my horror movie fear, and I probably went and saw that with people because I was in high school, but had to act brave, put on a brave face. Good movie though. That was more of a thriller than horror, I think. So yeah, I just want to shout out Wes Craven because I feel like you can't really talk about Scream without talking about Wes Craven. I just don't have a lot to say about him, but we've talked about him. Okay.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that you feel like that was more thriller than horror. That's how I feel about a lot of the slasher movies. Because, like, I know that they end up in the horror genre, but because, for the most part, they're less magic, like it's a guy killing people, that it tends to skew more towards the thriller than the horror side for me, which is why I think I can enjoy the Scream movies more than I could Nightmare on Elm Street, because Nightmare on Elm Street really terrified me.
Yeah, I mean, I think the line between thriller and horror, and we kind of talked about this with our Silence of the Lambs episode, I think it's a tenuous line, but also I think, like what you actually see, like in a thriller, I feel like you would see someone get approached in a dark alley, then it would cut away. But in horror, you would like see them get chased down and then eviscerated, and that's what you see in Scream.
Yeah.
So, and
true.
In Halloween, for example.
How do you guys feel about Scream within the slasher genre and how it compares to the other slasher movies? Because, like, for me, it's so much more interesting as a film because it's not taking itself fully seriously, which was basically my problem with a lot of slasher movies, where even Halloween, which is a classic, like by the end I was like, okay, like we're taking this so seriously, so dead serious. There's no wink at the camera, and it's just a tiny bit too ridiculous for me to believe in.
That is the exact thing I was going to say. That was a really, really good point, Hugo. So I saw Nightmare on Elm Street and Halloween both for the first time. I watched them this week because, again, not a horror guy, usually kind of a weenie when it comes to this. So I watched them for the first time this week. And, like, they are so self-serious for movies that if you take a step back are kind of ridiculous. And, like, that's kind of like, there's like a disconnect between the tone of the movies and how we watch them nowadays. And, like, yeah, maybe in 1978... it was, you could hear a pin drop in the theater. I'm sure people were on pins and needles and they were scared. But, like, now if you watch Halloween, you have a bunch of friends over, you have some drinks, you have some pizza, you kind of laugh at it. And, like they do in the movie Scream, for example, they do that exact thing. And so, like, that's how I feel like most people experience that kind of horror movie nowadays. But, like, that's not the tone of those horror movies. They are extremely self-serious, as Hugo just said. And, like, Scream is kind of, in my opinion, perfectly threading that needle of, like, kind of acknowledging those movies take themselves way too seriously because, like, they're kind of ridiculous if you think about them, but also, like, they're also scary. The idea of someone going around with a knife is scary. So that's what I think is the thing that I respond to most in Scream, is that it's really the tone, really, that in the meta commentary.
I completely agree with all that.
Yeah, so which is the next section of the outline. As I said earlier, Scream is credited as revitalizing the dying slasher genre, and they do that by kind of winking at the idea that slashers are dying. And they, like I said in the opening scene, Drew Barrymore kind of like disparages horror sequels and some horror movies, and like at the time that was kind of all we were getting, as Hugo alluded. Like, Nightmare on Elm Street came out in '84. This was 12 years later. Which, by the way, is wild to me, having watched Nightmare on Elm Street for the first time this week. Like, the fact that Wes Craven made that in 84 and then made this in 96. Nightmare on Elm Street looks like it could have been made in the 50s. And Scream looks like it could have been made last year. Like, and I get, maybe that's just, like, a difference in budget. Maybe it's just the 80s to the 90s aesthetic. But, like, it's wild.
Yeah.
It's wild to me.
The 80s horror genre movies all look really old to me.
Yes.
I don't know why.
I've always had a theory that he cast Skeet Ulrich because he looks a lot like a young Johnny Depp, who is in
He really does.
Nightmare on Elm Street.
He really
It's
does.
very noticeable, yeah. Even the haircut that they give him is just very similar to Johnny Depp in that movie.
That's also just a hunky 90s dude haircut, though. So
That is true. That is true.
So, like I said, the movie Scream is very winky at its own genre, and it kind of comments on itself. For example, like the killer very famously taunting his victims or would-be victims by invoking past horror movies. What's your favorite scary movie was I think the tagline that I remember from the trailer, and anytime anybody referenced Scream for the next 10 years, I would just say, what's your favorite scary movie? And talking about Freddy and talking about Jason and all that stuff with his victims. And then obviously, as I mentioned earlier, Jamie Kennedy's character Randy, he is the movie nerd in the movie, so he's kind of offering a very funny running commentary throughout the movie of well, if this were a horror movie, then this would happen. And as I invoked in the opening, his rules for surviving a horror movie, which I think is a very fun
really
moment.
funny moment.
And Katie, one of your favorite moments is not a spoiler yet, but when Jamie Kennedy as Randy is sitting on the couch. You want to take it from there?
Yep. I love it. So it's just one of those little meta moments that, once you watch it a few times, you notice it every time when he is watching Halloween and he's talking to the television to Jamie Lee Curtis and he says, Jamie, turn around, the killer's behind you, or whatever the dialogue is. And there's Jamie Kennedy sitting on the couch with the killer coming up behind him, Jamie Kennedy as Randy. And every time just makes my heart glow a little bit. I'm like,
Jamie,
yes,
turn around.
fit that
Jamie,
in there. Turn around, Jamie. Yep, so good.
Perfect.
I absolutely love that, honestly.
It almost makes me wonder, was Jamie Kennedy cast because Wes Craven wanted to make that joke?
I don't know. That could be something they thought of on set, possibly. Because
it's too perfect. It's perfect.
So good.
Yeah, all the direct, all the scenes where they are watching where they're watching Halloween and commenting on it, feel like that could have been an on-set idea. It wouldn't surprise me if that wasn't in the script and they just came up with it. Or maybe the script had something about Halloween, but they added on top of that just because it became funnier and funnier as they were going.
Yeah.
And for me, what's great about this is the comedy. The way it subverts this genre by taking this, all the slasher movies have this unstoppable killer who's indestructible, and what's scary about it that he keeps going, and whatever you do to him, you'll never be able to defeat him. You can get away, but you can't kill it. And Ghostface, or whatever you want to call the killer in this movie, just constantly gets beat the shit out of. He falls. He's it's kind of slapstick at times, and I find all that stuff he's really scary, but in a realistic way, because he's still just a guy in a robe, and it creates comedy and tension at the same time, which is always fun.
It sets up from the first time Ghostface is brawling with someone and he says oof when he gets hit. That immediately sets this character apart from every other horror movie you've ever seen, because you're immediately oh no, this is just a guy.
Yeah.
And Drew Barrymore damn near gets away in the opening scene.
Yeah.
She becomes very close to getting away. So if he can't just take out a high school girl, what else can he really do? I was also going to say, it also there's also comedy drawn from it kind of making fun of its own genre in some ways. For example, when in the first act or early in the second act, when the killer first calls Sydney and she goes out to the porch and calls his bluff and picks her nose and stuff. She says to him, I don't really like scary movies because it's insulting. Women are running up the stairs when they should be running out the front door. And then 2 minutes later, Sydney has to run up the stairs because the killer blocks the front door.
Yeah.
Because she walked back in. She locked her own front door. So she tries to go out the front door, which is the smart thing to do, but she's not able to do it. And then she has to run up the stairs.
And I feel like they don't hang too much of a lantern on that. They have that line of dialogue, and then a couple minutes later it actually happens. But I feel like they're not over the top pointing out. I don't know. I think it's fine.
I didn't notice it the first time I watched it, and I did this time. So
yeah, it's not like they had Ghostface say, "See, you fell for it," or some cheesy. Thing
I thought only dumb women were up the stairs when they should be going in the front door. Good stuff. So should we get into the plot? We're kind of already into the plot a bit, but I wanted to set aside some time to talk about the opening scene, just by itself.
Yeah.
As Hugo said, I'm sure some people who haven't even seen Scream as a whole may have seen this on YouTube, because it kind of is like its own standalone like horror short film, as apparently was originally conceived by Kevin Williamson as a standalone horror short film. But like, it's just, I think it's 13 minutes long, which is like pretty ballsy to just like start your movie with a 13-minute sequence in media res that's kind of only tangentially connected to the rest of the movie, but it's so freaking good. And it's honestly one of my favorite movie openings of all time, because like, I don't know, I'll stop talking. What do you guys think of the opening scene?
I mean, I think it is very standalone, and had it been released as a short film, as opposed to a part of this, I think it's this sort of short film that would immediately be bought and made into a feature film, because which is basically what happened with the script. Because
it's also like
it's that good. It's very self-contained, but it has a full plot even within that brief 15 minutes.
Well, if you expanded this little idea into a feature, it just becomes When a Stranger Calls, I think.
Yeah.
But as like a piece of feature, yeah. Hugo, what do you got in the opening scene?
I think it's amazing because it sets out everything that the film is in the 30-minute sequences. Like, if you the first time you see it, you might feel, oh, this is cool, but it's kind of like, oh, the movie hasn't even begun yet. But the second time you see it, you notice that all the elements of the film are in this opening scene in subtle ways. The meta commentary, the slapstick, even the fact that when he throws the chair through the window, that's like not a traditional horror villain move. It's kind of slapstick, it's kind of weird, and he's sneaking around the house as he's not able to find her. All of the stuff that's great about the movie is great in this 30-minute sequence, and it really puts you into this world. And it's also in some way the most violent part of the movie as well. I don't think the movie gets quite as graphic and even horrific as this opening scene. So it puts you into a horror mood, and then when the movie is, there are moments where it's more of a comedy, where it's more of a parody, it still retains that scare factor, because you've seen that at the beginning.
And definitely, that sequence ends pretty horrifically. Yeah, it's kind of funny at times, but it's pretty rough too at the end.
Oh yeah.
Well, and I thought I remember reading in the trivia while I was, I watched it on Amazon Prime, and they have the trivia that pulls up anytime you move your mouse. So I remember the trivia there was that they had shown the producers that initial clip, and they were concerned that it was too violent, but Wes Craven said that was the only take they had, even though that wasn't true. So that they could keep all of that in.
I've heard a version of that anecdote, not that exact thing, but like what I read is that Ken Williamson's script was extremely graphic, like describing entrails on characters' legs as they're slashed open, and the studio wanted to like dial that back, but then Wes Craven's like, no, we're not dialing that back. That's what I read. So that sounds like it's a similar theme to your story, but not sure. Katie, I know you have a special anecdote about the opening scene, but before we get to that, I just want to hear your thoughts on the opening scene in general.
Yeah, I mean, it's iconic. We all know that. And, what's funny is, so Josh and I actually went to a viewing of this movie at an outdoor cemetery earlier this summer, and it was really fun. It was a great setting, but moreover, there were a lot of people dressed in costumes. And interestingly enough, despite this just being 13 minutes, that
not many Ghostface costumes. No Ghostface costumes. Instead, what was it?
Almost no Ghostface costumes, but I would say dozens of Drew Barrymores. So dozens of Casey Beckers. So we had cream sweaters covered in fake blood and a blunt blonde bob wig. We had people in Letterman jackets playing Steve Orff. Like, people really connected to that, and that part has, I feel like, really just been a major part of pop culture history now. So it's iconic. Go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, the iconography of Scream in general, I think, is, yes, the Ghostface mask, but also Drew Barrymore. even though she's only in 10 minutes. Like, that's like the
Right.
iconography of the movie.
There are people walking around holding fake tin things of Jiffy Pop. Like the popcorn that she was making on the stove. Like, people really dialed into the costumes, and it was just funny to see because it's like, we recognized it instantly. And the way that maybe I wouldn't have recognized someone is Neve Campbell. Like, Drew Barrymore's character was just so recognizable, and she was able to just kind of become an icon. So I give them props for that, whether they were intending for that to be so memorable and kind of such, as Josh said, an icon of the series. They certainly achieved it. He previewed a little bit of a connection I have to that scene, and so much to my delight, my first job in Los Angeles, I actually worked at a test prep company, so nothing at all to do with the industry, but I discovered that my manager at the time, his name was Kevin Walls, also known as Kevin Patrick Walls, who you may have seen credited as Stephen Orff, aka Casey Becker's boyfriend, who got taped to a chair, had his mouth taped shut, and was sadly bludgeoned in front of her. So Kevin actually auditioned for the Skeet Ulrich role as Billy. Unfortunately didn't get it, but they did like him, and so he got the dubious honor of being taped to a chair in Casey's backyard.
He's
the
first kill in Scream. We the guy who was first killed in Scream.
That's a fun.
Yep,
That's awesome.
So, and as someone who has loved this movie for so long, you can imagine my absolute thrill of walking into a test prep company and finding out that I was working for Stephen Orff. So it was a real boon for me. But yeah, it's a great scene. I really love it.
Cool.
Yeah.
I just
Great
wanted
eye
to,
acting.
I just wanted to say that I looked up that bit of trivia. It wasn't the producers that they showed it to. It was the MPAA that wanted to cut out the graphic. They wanted to cut out the graphic shot of the killer stabbing Drew Barrymore. And then Wes Craven said that was the only take they had, which was not true.
Yeah, I mean, like you guys have all said, I think the opening scene is it's iconic. It as Hugo said, it kind of sets up everything you're going to get in the movie from a commentary, satire, comedy perspective, but also like a horror perspective. I also think it just like it works so well, and like I kind of struggled to put into. I tried to explain this to Katie, like my thoughts on this, and I kind of couldn't put into words. But like it when you watch it, you kind of feel it. Like I've said I don't really like horror, but like watching this opening scene for the first time, I was like, okay, I'm in good hands. Even though I don't like, I'm nervous and I'm scared, but like I can tell that this guy knows what he's doing, and like this isn't cheap. Like these scares are earned, I think, in my mind, and like I think it's part of the way the camera moves. And, like, how the blocking is. Like, Drew Barrymore will kind of be, like, moving to her left, and the camera's kind of panning with her as she moves. But, like, you can't, like, see what she's looking at. So, like, I'm kind of, like, constantly watching the edges of the frame. I'm watching the background. And I'm just, like, very nervous just based on how the camera is moving. And I can't really, like, explain how that is or why that is. But, like, it is, though. Like, I'm nervous because of how the camera is moving and how the character's moving within the frame.
Yeah, there's something about the camera cutting very infrequently in this scene that makes it all the more jarring.
It's very wandering. It kind of swoops around. It's very
it swoops
wandering
around,
camera.
and it never allows you to see everything that you want to see as an audience member.
Yes.
And that's where it makes you feel that tension. It's also a lot of close-ups, and you don't know what's happening outside of that, and it just
and music cues, good music cues.
The music is great. Not just in this opening scene, but for the entire movie. The music does. Like it uses sort of a similar, like almost cheesy 80s horror movie, kind of soundtrack, but it works really, really well in setting up all that tension.
Also, in terms of tension, here's a good free tip for you for your movie. If you want to have tension in your scene, put something on the stove, because that just like kind of implicitly makes the scene more tense, because that's gonna boil over eventually, and that happens in this scene. It starts popping, and then suddenly the kitchen's full of smoke, and the alarm's going off, and like it just ramps up. It's a ticking time bomb basically if you put something on the stove. So good job, Wes Craven.
If just to double back a second on the music, the one thing so I was watching with Julia the other night, and yesterday night it was the first time watching it, and she noticed that the theme song for the show Peaky Blinders is in this for some reason, which was really weird. Yeah, there's a few scenes where you can hear the theme song for Peaky Blinders. Don't ask me why.
I wonder if they took that, because that came out like 20 years after this movie came out.
Way after.
Yep, it's very funny. But apart from that, the one thing I think the music doesn't do in this movie, it doesn't give the killer, I think, an iconic like theme, which is something that other slasher movies do have, and I think it's the only thing that I would say about the music that I didn't love, because I was waiting for it. I was thinking, oh, is there some like repetition on when he's on screen? Do we hear similar music? And yes, but there isn't really an iconic theme that comes with that character.
I thought about that when I was watching the movie, and I kind of justified it as another way of subverting the horror movie tropes.
I mean, that could be.
Because, again, this is not an actual movie monster, and in some ways it even adds to the tension, because in those other movies, when you start to hear the theme of the bad guy, you know someone's about to get got. So in this way, it there adds the possibility for more surprise, at least for me.
I think I am going to agree with you, Grizz, because it's one of those things for me that, to your point, because the movie is kind of its own entity that's sort of subverting the trope, I think that were there a common thread and like a Halloween-type score behind the killer, that might take me out of it a little bit. I think in some ways, not having a score has helped it kind of age into the new millennium. It feels a little bit more modern. Moreover, I think that... I don't know. I think what it does do well is, and what we noticed kind of on a repeat watch, is the way that we get kind of the music cue around almost anyone that could possibly be a killer. So many people in this movie get that treatment. Almost everybody except for pretty much Sydney and Tatum at some point or another get the kind of the shock music cue. So I personally... And granted, I think that Scream can do no wrong, so I'm maybe not looking at this as critically, but I think that they do a really good job using their music cues kind of to the fullest effect.
That is true. I really like the music cues and the sound design and the sound effects that they use. I think sometimes add to both the tension and the comedy in a really good way, for sure.
And the horror, honestly.
Yeah.
I wanted to give a brief plot summary before we get into spoilers and before I ask you for your general take on the movie, but there's not a ton of plot to really get into. I guess the setup of the movie is Sidney Prescott, played by Neve Campbell, her mom was killed a year before the events of the movie, and there's a man named Cotton Weary, played by Lee Schreiber very briefly in this movie. He's more in Scream 2. He was convicted of Sidney's mother's murder and is currently on death row based on Sidney's testimony. But now there's a killer on the loose again, as we see in the opening scene. He kills Drew Barrymore, and that's kind of it. And then horror ensues. But I just wanted to shout out the cast, which I think is really good. So we got Rose McGowan as Tatum, who's Sydney's best friend. Skeet Ulrich as Billy Loomis, a reference to Halloween, where Dr. Loomis is one of the main characters. He's Sydney's boyfriend. Jamie Kennedy, previously mentioned as Randy. Matthew Lillard as Stu. I freaking love Matthew Lillard in this movie so much. Courtney Cox as Gail Weathers, the kind of clout-chasing reporter. And David Arquette as Deputy Dewey. Fun fact, Courtney Cox and David Arquette met on this movie, and they were married for like 11 years. And then shout out to Henry Winkler as Principal Himbry. Yeah, love Henry Winkler.
Yeah. I mean, Skeet Ulrich spells his last name wrong, but he's very, very good in this role. And it like, honestly, I don't know him from a lot of other stuff. And what did he do? What did he do after Scream?
I don't know him from much stuff either. The only thing I really know him from is the year after this, he has a pretty small role in As Good as It Gets. If you've seen As Good as It Gets, kind of like one of the inciting incidents is Greg Kinnear gets like beat up in a home invasion kind of situation, and like Skeet Ulrich is part of that. So he's only in the first maybe 10 or 15 minutes, and then he's off. But like that was a really big movie. As Good as It Gets,
yeah,
it was an enormous movie actually. But like so makes sense that he comes off Scream, which also was a big movie, and gets As Good as It Gets. But like beyond those two, I have absolutely no idea what happened to him.
Yeah,
because like it feels like he's positioned to like take off, but as far as I know, he never really took off.
Because after this, Jamie Kennedy went on to have a fairly decent comedy movie career. Like he hasn't had he's not like superstar, but he did a few more things after this. Mm-hmm. And of course, Henry Winkler's Henry Winkler. Matthew Lillard went on to do the Scooby-Doo movies, which like he's really good as Shaggy.
I think I read that he came to his girlfriend was auditioning for Scream, and he just like came along with her. It's like that classic thing you see in like movies and TV where someone who's like not auditioning gets the part because they like his energy or whatever. Like apparently that actually happened to Matthew Lillard in this movie.
And then, of course, Courtney Cox obviously was Courtney Cox and went on to great success and was already a great success.
Well, yeah, Friends had already been on the air for a couple years.
Yeah.
Apparently, she campaigned hard for this part because she wanted to play like a mean person to differentiate a character from Monica on Friends, and that's why she's kind of a bitch in this. That was on purpose because she is. So I great cast, yeah. But like, I just want to ask you guys in general before we get into spoilers. What do you think of Scream? I'm gonna start with Hugo, who kind of already gave his opinion, but go ahead.
Yeah, my opinion is it's one of my favorite horror movies. It's for sure my favorite slasher movie because, the ones I've seen, and I've seen the more iconic ones, all of them have had the same problem where after a while it was just taking itself way too seriously and it just stopped being fun. And maybe I didn't watch them in the ideal setting, as you said. Maybe if I was watching them with friends with pizza and beer, we would have fun. But like by myself in my room just watching this movie, after a while, every time they cut back to Donald Pleasance just saying something really dark and obscure about, oh, this is pure evil, I'm like, okay, sure. It just kind of put me off of the movie and didn't make it as interesting for me. And this one, in some ways, because it's a parody, it's even scarier than those, because it's like when the tension is on, it's kind of a break from the more lighthearted tone that other parts of the movie have, and it works better that way. So yeah, I really enjoy it, and honestly, I'm going to watch the sequel this week. So
yeah, to your point, you said like it's interesting that like the points that when you're able to exhale in normal horror movies,
yeah,
Scream knows those points and kind of like throws in parts to put you ill at ease when you would normally be at ease. Because again, it knows horror movies, it knows the structure, and it kind of uses that against you. Like I'm thinking of the scene in the high school bathroom, which is just say in broad daylight, she's at school, she's surrounded by people, you think she's safe, and then Ghostface comes out of the stall. And you're like, what the hell? Where can you go?
How long have you been in there?
Grizz, what do you think of Scream? I think you're probably less high on it than we are.
No, actually, I really do like it.
Okay, cool.
And I would probably agree that it's probably my favorite slasher. I probably like it about as much as I liked Halloween, but I like them for very different reasons. And to Hugo's point about how the comedy services the horror aspects, I think it's like higher highs of tension and due to the comedy bringing the tension so much further down, and it really works so well in concert. I really do. I do like this movie a lot, and I can't say that about most horror movies.
Catherine, biggest Scream fan I know. What do you got on Scream? What's your history with the Scream movies, I guess I should say?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So my history probably goes back a lot longer than most of you guys. So to the point where I had to text my dad and say, hey, how old was I when I first watched the Scream movies? So this came out in December 96, right shortly after my 7th birthday. My dad said he thought I was 8 or 9 when I watched it for the first time. So that gives me almost 25 years of Scream viewings. So I think I am either uniquely qualified or uniquely disqualified to really analyze this movie because it is like in my blood at this point. I absolutely love the movie. I think that because of how many times I've seen it and also like how many stages of life I've watched it in, that's a weird thing to call out, but I watched it as a kid who was too young to watch it. I watched it as a teenager, I watched it as a young adult, and I watched it as a not as young adult. So I feel like every probably stage of life, I have like gleaned something new from it. I'm so far removed that I have no idea who I originally thought was the killer. I don't know how scared I was or wasn't because it was 25 years ago. But it has held up, and Josh knows this about me. I'm not the kind of person that necessarily, wants a movie over an hour 45 is almost always a no-go for me. And I know that that's probably not kosher to say on a podcast like this, but I will just share that perspective. I'm kind of a TV gal. I have a short attention span. This movie's got a close to 2-hour runtime, and I will never turn down sitting down for it. I just think it is a tight hour 50 or whatever the exact runtime is. I think it is a delightful movie. I still think it's scary, but it's kind of softened around the edges. And to Hugo's point, I laugh every time I watch the movie. I think there's some really genius comedic acting and just really a great film.
You're also not one to rewatch movies. Like, I'll watch the same movie over and over again, but you're not like that as much. You still have seen this dozens of times.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what's the movies that I will rewatch kind of tend like they are more often than not like a rom-com, like maybe a When Harry Met Sally or a teen movie like 10 Things I Hate About You.
A more traditional comfort movie.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that is why like I do want to like really give Scream props that it has somehow kind of wormed its way into my heart as a comfort movie, because most movies with a guy in a ghost mask and a sharp knife and that has the word entrails in the script are probably not going to be someone's comfort movie, but for me it has made it.
Makes you feel safe. What do you got, Chris?
Well, so I just had a question, because this was the second time I've seen Scream. First time, I really enjoyed it. The second time, I was worried that I wasn't going to enjoy it as much, because obviously I knew how it was going to end. But I found while I was watching it the second time that it enabled me to focus on things that I didn't focus on the first time through, and so in that way I still enjoyed it just as much. How does that hold up on a third, fourth, fifth, sixth rewatch?
I think it holds up marvelously, personally. Like, I'm like, so Katie and I watched it this past weekend, and like, I don't know, I've seen it probably close to 10 times at this point, and like, I picked up on new things that, like, Katie kind of mentioned this earlier, and I want to talk about this in more detail, but they really do leave clues for a number of characters as potentially the killer. And like, there was one subtle one that I'd never noticed before, and that was, there's a really funny scene where the police sheriff is smoking a cigarette, and David Arquette, Deputy Dewey, is eating an ice cream cone, and every time he takes a drag on a cigarette, Dewey takes a lick of his ice cream cone. It's really funny. But then at the end of that scene, the sheriff throws a cigarette on the ground and tamps it out, and he's wearing black boots. Mm-hmm. The black boots that we just saw a few minutes earlier in the bathroom of the high school when he comes out of the stall and attacks Sydney. So like, they don't do much more than that to tie the sheriff to being the killer, but that is like an example of like using a visual signifier we associate with the killer and putting it to another character, and so just like adding his name to the list of suspects. And like, I never noticed that before, but you know, it does a lot of stuff like that.
Just to touch on that, I think it's a thing with the mid-90s where it was the age of postmodernism and films being self-aware and playing with tropes in other films. I mean, you have Pulp Fiction behind you, and that's a prime example. And I think they're all the type of movie that you can watch multiple times, because there's so much, there are so many little things that the movie is planting here and there that you wouldn't notice on a first watch, and maybe not even on a second or third watch. And there's always, like, every single scene is meta and self-aware, and is playing with words and with story structure and stuff, and there's always something to discover in it that maybe doesn't even have much of consequence for the whole movie. As you said, like the thing with the boots, like, I didn't notice that, but it doesn't really matter in the end, but on your 10th watch you notice that and you're like, oh god, wow, they thought of that as well. And it's one of those types of movies that you can watch over and over again, I think, and find something new.
Katie?
One last thing to add. So I totally agree with what Hugo and Grizz have said thus far. So another point, just in kind of reflecting on the movie after having watched the whole original trilogy. So I think it's fun to go back and see the ways in which they either lay the groundwork or at least retroactively make some fun connections between movies. So this is not a major plot point, but around that scene with the boots with the sheriff, Dewey talks about how they might make a movie about these events, and says to Sid, "Oh, I could see you being played by a young Meg Ryan," and she says, "With my luck, it would be Tori Spelling." Lo and behold, Scream 2, when they're making a movie about the events of the Woodsboro murders, who's playing Sydney but Tori Spelling? Like, they just do these kind of fun things that in the moment, you don't think anything of, but once you've seen Scream 2 and yeah, that was Tori Spelling, it just makes it kind of fun. And they do this throughout the movie, and I think once you're able to kind of get the bird's eye view and say, okay, well, this is what happened in this movie, and then the next and the next, you can zoom out and say, they actually did a pretty artful job of setting things up. I mean, you have to suspend your disbelief because it's a horror movie, and some of the stuff that they pull is kind of ridiculous, but they actually set it up pretty well. And I think beyond just the little things you notice, because I notice something new every time, and it's to the point where, I'm trying to figure out, what exactly is happening with Ghostface at any given time. I don't want to spoil our killer reveal exactly.
We're about spoilers, aren't we?
Okay.
We're an hour in.
I'll throw it up. Spoilers.
Okay. All right. So what I was going to say is that we do have two killers. So at any given time, when I'm rewatching the movie and they're on the phone, I'm like, that's Stu, that's Billy, that's Billy, that's Stu. And I'm thinking about who is making each kill. Right. And that's something that first time through, you don't know that there's two killers. You don't know who's the killer. Once you've seen it 25 times, I can be like, that's him, that's him, that's him, that's him. And it just makes it kind of fun to be a little bit more analytical about it.
For the record, I've only seen it again maybe 8 or 10 times. I am not yet to the point where I'm thinking about who the killer is at a given moment. Every time the killer's on screen, I'm just like, ooh, yeah, cool, okay, yeah, good scene. I'm never like,
I was trying last night, and there were a few times where I'm like, oh, I'm really not sure. I don't know.
Well, Katie can probably give you a dissertation on like who is who and why.
I'm to the point where I can tell by how they speak. Like, for example, it's obviously Stu in the beginning because of the way he talks to Casey. Casey's his ex-girlfriend. I've got a lot of nitty-gritty feelings about that. You can definitely tell, and like, aside from their alibis, sometimes you can even tell by their tone of voice, even through the voice box. So that's where you'll be in about 30 more viewings of the movie. You'll be analyzing their voices.
Well, I do want to talk about the killer reveal and like the misdirect and who you guys thought the killer was. But before we do that, I want to briefly give my take on Scream, even though I've basically already given it. And that is, so I didn't see it for the first time until about 5-6 years ago. I actually saw it for the first time when Katie and I were dating because she told me it was one of her favorite movies. And I've watched it at least once a year since then, often more than once a year. I think, Katie, we've like randomly watched it like 3 times in 2021. I think we watched it in the spring. We watched it at the Hollywood Forever Cemetery. We watched it this week for the podcast. And it's on the list of, 30 or so movies that you could offer to put on at any moment. And I'll say, yes, I'll watch that right now. I don't care if I watched it yesterday. I'll watch that again. I really, really love it. And I think I kind of mentioned earlier that my favorite aspect is like the meta commentary. As I've mentioned many times in this podcast, I eat that shit up, the meta stuff. But like, it can be a little too much. Deadpool is kind of flirting with being a little too much and a little too up its own ass. But right. I think again, Scream kind of really threads the needle. And I feel like, I don't know, it's just like a perfect tone for me. Because like it's the things that I'm like laughing about watching Nightmare on Elm Street or Halloween, they're laughing about in this. But it's also still very scary. It's funny. I love the Randy character, and Scream's great. But we were just talking about the killer, so I want to talk about the misdirects on the killer. I kind of already mentioned the Boots and the Sheriff. Katie and I were watching this past weekend with a friend who'd never seen it before, and she was very convinced she knew who the killer was as we were watching, and she ended up being wrong. So, do you guys remember the first time you watched it, who you thought the killer might be? Grizz, who'd you think it was?
I was pretty sure that it was Billy for the vast majority of the movie, and then Billy gets stabbed, and I'm like, oh my god, was I wrong? And then, no, I wasn't, but I was.
Well, they also, they make you think it's Billy, in, about half an hour in, all clues point to Billy, but then he's kind of, his name is cleared, basically.
Well, and even when his name was cleared, I was like, I was thinking, that is a little convenient. So I was still suspicious of him the entire time. But and
then Sydney puts that together too. She kind of realizes it's a little convenient the way that his name was cleared, and then before she could even process that, he's stabbed.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
I think they do a good job of that.
I was right there with Sydney. I was like, oh my god, no, really?
Yeah,
yeah. Because who did you call from the station?
Yeah,
that's a great line.
That sequence is great because, again, she realizes his story doesn't actually add up, but, right as that happens, he gets stabbed. So, it's a real whiplash of suspecting Billy. Hugo, do you remember who you thought the killer was when we first watched?
I was convinced, the first time I was convinced it was Stu right away. As soon as we met him, I was like, come on, this guy's a creep. This guy's a slimy, he's probably in it. And funnily enough, I watched it with Julia, my girlfriend, last night for the first... She hadn't seen it before, as I said before, and she was super convinced that it was Billy. So, in a way, we both got it half right at the end. I remember, obviously you suspect Billy at the beginning, but for me it was always, he was at the door 1 second ago, and then he shows up at the window, so it just couldn't be him. And I think the movie also does something really clever there, where after that scene where they walk away and then the police shows up, the camera moves through the whole house and gives you an idea of what the killer would have had, where the killer would have had to go to get to the window. And it takes a while because it's a big house. And to me, that was this is the movie telling me it's not Billy. We're supposed to suspect him, but it's definitely not him. And then when it turns out to be him, I was really surprised at the end.
Katie, who did our friend think was the killer as we were watching this past weekend?
This was really wild for me, but she thought that Dewey was the killer.
I was just about to say.
Really?
She was very convinced. I don't remember her exact phrase, but she was like, "I would bet anything that it's Dewey." And I had to struggle to keep my face straight because I wanted to be like, "Are you freaking kidding me, girl?" Like,
why?
Like, what? Like, because in this movie, and whenever he's seen subsequently, and however many movies he makes his appearance in, I won't spoil it. He's just so like soft and hapless. Yeah,
he's a bumbling idiot.
Exactly. They call him Deputy Dewdrop. I don't remember if that's in this movie or a different one, but like. He's Dewdrop. And I was just like, how on earth? And I'm like, that's a testament to the movie that they're creating this possibility that who I think of as Deputy Dewdrop, for a first-time viewer, could be a killer.
So when Billy got stabbed, because the whole time I was watching, I think it's Billy, but I want to have a backup for if it's not Billy. And Dewey was actually my second choice because I felt like the one person who was not being shown to have any of the features of the killer, as much. Like, and he's kind of like, because he's a bumbling idiot, like I could generate a motive that like, people have treated him like a lesser person. And so that gives him his motive for why he's taking it out on all these people. So I came up with a reason for why it could be Dewey, even though I was still more suspicious of Billy.
And it's funny you say that. And it's funny that our friend Reagan thought it was him because another thing that I never noticed on my first however many watches is, around the start of Act 3, where they're at the house party, Dewey gets a call about a suspicious vehicle in the woods nearby, and he asks Courtney Cox, "Do you want to go check it out with me?" And as they head for his car, he says, "Actually, ma'am, I was thinking we might walk." As soon as he says that, there is a music cue, like the ominous music cue that's been playing throughout the movie, and it's the only time that I hear that music cue when Dewey's speaking, but that's like kind of an ominous line if you're not sure what his motivation is, and like the music cue, and on top of that, like, that is suggesting that Dewey could possibly be the killer, and I never once noticed that. But like, that's again my point that I was making earlier, that they really do lay breadcrumbs for a lot of different characters and offer them the possibility of being the killer. Especially Jamie Kennedy. Like, they say over and over again, like, Jamie Kennedy even says, like, "I agree, if it's a horror movie, I should be a prime suspect," and that's fun. I like that stuff. But killer does turn out to be Billy and Stu. And Stu. Before we get to that, though, basically almost the whole back half of the movie is like this extended house party that kind of becomes a taut third act climax. And so I was reading the trivia section, and apparently the cast and crew jokingly called it the longest night in horror history because it's, again, like 45 minutes at this one location. And so after they wrapped production, they had shirts made that said, "I survived scene 118," which is what they called this sequence at the house. And separate fun fact, earlier this month, I learned that this house is on Airbnb, not as like a normal Airbnb vacation house, but as like a special promotional thing. Just later this month, you paid $5 a night, and you could go to this house, and they had all the Scream movies on VHS. They had pizza for you, and apparently David Arquette like recorded like the house rules, and like he would appear over video for the guests. And the Airbnb listing also kind of suggested that like Ghostface might show up. So like it would be like an experience kind of thing staying at this house.
Nope.
And I really tried to get it. I tried to get it. I tried to book it, but it went live at 10 a.m. on Tuesday, and I was on my phone at 10 a.m. on Tuesday, and it was booked before I could even load the page. So
I just want to say, I would never do that because it's the exact same reason I don't go to haunted houses and stuff like that. Is because I have this worry that my fight or flight instinct's going to kick in, and I'm going to choose fight, and I'm going to murder this actor playing Ghostface.
I would also not handle that well if I was staying at the Scream house for a night, and then Ghostface was knocking on the window at 3 a.m. because. In my mind, that's like the perfect murder is to dress up as Ghostface when someone's supposed to be dressed up as Ghostface, and like he's supposed to be there to taunt you, but he actually kills you. Like that'd be that'd be a Scream ass.
That's Scream.
And that's
so meta.
That's Scream 6 right there.
So meta.
They're actually filming in the house, and they're going to use it. It's going to be a found footage movie.
Oh my God.
Well, the other thing about this, like Act 2 into Act 3 sequence is apparently they got a studio note at the script level. Bob Weinstein realized that they went 30 full script pages, i.e. about 30 minutes of movie, without a kill happening. And he said, you need to throw an extra kill in there. And so Kevin Williamson wrote in Henry Winkler dying in the middle of the movie, which shout out to Henry Winkler. And Kevin Williamson realized that actually solved that actually solves a narrative problem, because what he was thinking is like, second half of Act 2 is a big house party at this house, but Act 3, it's only a few people, basically only our main characters in the house, and that's when the killer starts to pick people off. And he needed a way to get all of the non-important characters out of the house, and the principal's murder is what ends up doing that, because they hear that he was murdered, and they're like, oh, we gotta go check it out, and so they leave, and leaving Jamie Kennedy behind.
I have a problem with that plot point.
Me too.
I'm able to suspend disbelief with a lot of the stuff that the teenagers do in this movie on the grounds of, okay, they're high schoolers, their impulse control parts of their little lizard brains haven't really kicked in. But if someone told me when I was 17 that my principal had been gutted and hung on a goalpost, my reaction would be to have like a panic attack and go home, not to be like, fuck yeah, let's go check it out and bring him down.
Before they bring him down. Yeah.
Katie, that's true.
Totally insane.
How many high school boys have you met? Because like high school boys are pretty stupid. Pre-internet they'd be pretty bored in this small town. Something's happening finally. Let's go see the principal dead.
I'll be honest, I would not have gone to see the dead principal.
No, me neither. But I'm saying, in
fact, I probably would have called the police and said, "Hey, there's a bunch of these high school kids that are going to go check out the principal's dead body before you guys get a chance to take it down. Maybe
so get it down quickly.
Maybe put a cordon off the school there, please."
Yeah, that's trauma that you're giving to yourself.
Yeah,
there are a lot of psycho boys at this high school, as we learned, because Billy and Stu let themselves be the killer. And I just want to shout out, I love the moment right before the killer is revealed. It's when Dewey's just been stabbed, which crossed Dewey off the list of suspects, and Sidney grabs his gun, and Stu and Randy both approach her, like, begging her that the other one's the killer, and please give me the gun, please help me. And she doesn't know who to trust or who to save, so she just says, F you both, and closes the door on them. I think that's a really effective scene. I don't know, that's kind of a trope, I guess, where there's, like, one person's the killer, one person's not the killer, and they're both pretending the other person is. Like, that's maybe a trope, but, like...
I mean, it's a trope.
I think it works.
It's a trope, but it works because then the third person is also the killer, like...
In this
Billy
case,
shows back up, and he's all bloody, and he's like, oh, give me a gun. And she trusts him at this point because he got stabbed.
And she gives him the gun.
Yeah. And then
he shoots Randy.
And then he turns, like, he does a really good heel turn, because he's like, we've seen him be a little creepy throughout the movies. There are moments where he shows, like, this creepy stare that he does. But with Sidney, he's always been, Mr. Nice Guy. And, he does the heel turn really well. He just turns around and he just has this really scary, stare on his face.
Is that the first time you see him smile in the whole movie?
I mean, it could be. Like,
when he reveals himself to be the killer?
He's very moody.
I don't know. Sorry, go ahead, Kitty.
I just wanted to give good old Sid some props, because she has, like, preternaturally good instincts and sense. And they do call that out, like we mentioned earlier. Like, she's like, why does everyone run up the stairs and you could just run out the front door? Like, she has really good instincts, and throughout most of the movies, like, she really makes the right call. And that's because she's our heroine. I mean, she's, the one that we do really want to keep safe, but I gotta call her out. Really poor instincts. This guy that she has suspected as the killer, that has been, like, pressuring her to have sex and just, like, really weird. And Hugo, I feel like I have to disagree that he's always been really nice to her, because
no, but I mean,
I'm not so sure.
No, he's not been nice.
Okay.
He's been really creepy and, like, predatory in some ways, but but he's played nice with her. That's what I'm saying.
Sure.
There's literally a scene where he goes, "Why can't you get over your dead mom and have sex with me?"
Yep.
Yeah, not a good guy.
Dream guy.
Definitely.
But yeah, then she hands him the gun, and that's one of her biggest missteps in the series, I would say. I mean, luckily, she really redeems herself in the ending, because Homegirl, she has guts. The fact that she not only manages to get herself out of that, but does it with some panache. She takes some time to, like, really show it up and dress up in the costume and use the voice box and all that.
Yeah.
I dig it, but a poor choice to hand over the gun to Billy, to say the least.
But yeah, so Billy and Stu reveal themselves to be dual killers, which I think is a good twist.
Yep.
You spend the whole movie trying to figure out who it is, and like it's two people, so it was kind of impossible to figure out who it was, to some extent. I really enjoy the scene where they kind of like explain themselves to Sydney, particularly because Matthew Lillard is just dialed up to 12, and I love everything he's doing. I really like Matthew Lillard in this.
When she says you guys are crazy, and he's like licking like the gun is like, we prefer psychotic. Like, yeah, you're psychotic, dude.
He's unhinged, and I love every second, every choice he's making. And I have here in the outline that apparently the studio people were split on what they wanted the killer's motivation to be, and they're split on whether they thought it was scarier to have a personal connection for the killer or for the killer to have no motivation. And as kind of an allusion to that disagreement at the studio level, Kevin Williamson wrote both, where Billy has a personal connection to why he's doing this, but Stu jokingly says peer pressure is the reason that he's doing these killings.
Josh, are you referring to Sid's bubble butt boyfriend, Billy? Is that who we're talking about?
That's who I'm referring to. Yes.
Okay, just wanted to clarify. Thanks.
Does Tatum call him that at some point?
No, that girl in the bathroom does. Her bubble butt boyfriend. Bathroom, yeah. Just one of my favorite lines that I had to just squeak in there.
That girl's mean. Yeah, that girl's really mean. Yeah.
Yeah. She is like not well. Yeah, and yes. As the only girl here, I have to say, that's not what girls' bathrooms are like. You don't just go and just absolutely rip someone to shreds when especially in a public restroom like that.
And their dead mother, too.
Yeah, that's a little, they dialed it up, but I guess some good exposition there.
Blame Ricky Lake, I guess, because that's who she blames in that.
Well, and I believe that cheerleader, it was actually Skeet Ulrich's girlfriend at the time.
Oh, wow. Well, that's why she's jealous, I guess.
I think that was one of the trivias I found.
So yeah, I really enjoy this ending a lot. I think it's they kind of like go back and forth like with the motivations. They originally say there's no motivation, then Billy reveals he has one. Then like Stu does, like they kind of go back. I'm really strung along. I'm along for the ride. And I think it's really good. I love the way Sydney gets the best of these guys. Also very satisfying, very cathartic.
And I really like the moment where they start stubbing each other because like they
can't resist. They can't they know they need to be careful and not hurt each other too bad, but they can't resist doing it because they're psychotic.
And Matthew is like, "Oh man, I'm really hurting over here, man. I'm feeling woozy."
Anytime I watch this with anybody, I always have to say out loud at that moment that it's my least favorite part of the movie because it is. Just the idea of getting stabbed on purpose is like a lot for me to handle. And like and like you said, Grizz, the way they give instructions, like, all right, stick to the side and not too deep. And then like Billy just like keeps giving to Matthew Lillard, and as Hugo just alluded, like, I'm feeling kind of woozy here, man. I think I'm dying. Like, it's just it's hard to watch, but it illustrates how crazy they are. I guess
they're really crazy,
and you can tell. Like, I'm basing this off Criminal Minds, so if this is fake and you're a criminologist, please correct me. But in Criminal Minds, they often do this thing where whenever there's a duo that's doing serial killing, there's always like a dynamic where one is the leader and one is sort of an alpha and beta type thing, where one is the collected leader who has the motive and then the other one is just kind of going along with it. And they really do this in this movie because like Billy is playing the calm and collected and, well, not calm and collected, he's clearly really psychotic, but Stu is just completely all over the place and he's just kind of following him. And you get that scene later when Sid has managed to get the voice box and he calls him and she says like, "Oh, I've already alerted the police, so you're not going to get out of this." And Stu is just hanging by the phone and he's like dripping blood everywhere and he's like, "Oh man, my dad's going to kill me." Like, that's so good.
And I believe Stu's final line in the movie is one of Katie's favorite lines, which is what?
"I always had a thing for you, Sid." And she says, "In your dreams." Boom,
and then
television.
Knocks a TV onto his face.
Yeah.
I guess his last line's a little moan after the TV crushes his head. Yeah.
That's true. Can I call something out really quick, Josh, on the topic?
Yeah.
I mean, I just feel like they really personify with the killers. Like, if Scream is two things, if it's a true horror movie, and if it's a parody, we've got Billy is the true horror movie, and Stu is the parody. And they just really married those two perfectly.
That's a great point.
Very smart.
Thank you. And another thing I have to say, just to continue praising Matthew Lillard in this movie, is that at least Josh, I know Hugo and Grizz, I'm not hearing you do it as much, but Josh, when you're talking about it, you're saying Billy really went in on Matthew Lillard, and like he was like, I associate him with this movie. Like when I think about, I don't think of Stu, I think of Matthew Lillard, and when I think like he brought it home, as you guys have said, like the tongue acting, the crazy faces, the tone of voice, like he really dials it up. But at least for me, and I could understand a disagreement, but for me, at no point does it really go over the edge. Like he is on the edge, but it just really makes sense, and it provides a lot of comic relief. But to me, it still tracks. It's like this guy's just freaking nuts, and he's along for the
freaky.
ride.
So like, there's one point where I think like is that he might be going a little over, like too crazy, and that's earlier in the movie when he's talking to Jamie Kennedy, Randy, and Randy's like talking about how like he there goes my chance with Sid, and he like kind of like guffaws and puts his hand to his, and I'm like,
I love that scene though.
I do.
That scene makes me laugh every time.
I'm like,
I'm
okay,
laughing
so
now just thinking about it.
That might be a little over the top, but it is like then in retrospect, seeing that like he's a legit crazy person, it's like kind of perfect.
Yeah, like what's funny about him as well is like he's really out there as a performance already in the film. And you're like, oh, this guy is a little over the top, And for me, it was like, oh, this guy's definitely the killer. But regardless of that, at the end, he goes completely unhinged. And it almost makes you feel like, oh, what he was doing before, he was trying to hold it back, but some of the crazy was like coming out even in normal situations. And it retroactively makes it work better for me.
That's how I felt about it too. It's like he's so unhinged there at the end that it's like, oh, okay, now this is crazy.
Yeah.
But also to go back to that specific line read you just alluded to, Grizz, I also love that like he goes big in response to Randy saying, "Do you think I had a chance with Sid?" And he goes big for a second, but then like goes completely deadpan and just goes, "No, no." He goes like, no. It's just, I love it. I also love in this ending, they do like the "I wasn't really dead" thing. I think a couple of times. But Courtney Cox is like the main one where she is like, knocked unconscious and then wakes up and has the gun, right? That's how what happens, right? And she
wakes up, comes to, finds the gun. She does her little, when she thinks she's going to just wrap it all up and then the safety's on.
Yeah.
Come on, Gail.
Poor Gail.
Come on, Gail.
Yep.
But then,
and they also do the thing where Billy is lying down and he wakes up and he does like this weird monster scream. He's like, ah! Like this.
Not in my movie. Bang.
He just shoots him in the head. That's great.
Okay.
And that's Scream, basically.
I did want to touch on one thing with Courtney Cox's character, Gail Weathers. She should have been a weather person, right? Like, Gail Weathers is the name of a television weather person. Am I wrong?
She does call that out. She says, Gail Weathers, you sound like a meteorologist.
Yeah, she should have been.
Yeah. I guess that would have been harder to forward the plot, though. Especially kind of subsequent plots. They lean on her being a writer a little bit more, at least in Scream 2.
I liked her as this sort of secondary villain character in the movie, where you're really annoyed at her whenever she's in in the scene, and then by the end, you kind of like her a bit more, but earlier you're definitely really annoyed by her.
She's definitely giving you the major like gossip television anchor vibe there.
Like, leave these people alone, they're going through some stuff.
People are literally being murdered.
Yeah.
So Courtney Cox, if you've watched the trailer for Scream 5, she's in the trailer for Scream 5. So, light spoilers, Courtney Cox makes it through all 4 Scream movies. But I feel like she has... Yeah, she's a secondary villain in this. I feel like she becomes more part of the core cast in subsequent movies. I think she's got a... She and, Dewey have more of a romance in Scream 2, which I guess is probably due to the fact that Courtney Cox and David Arquette had an actual romance. They have kind of like a fake romance, like a transactional, like she kind of comes on to him in a transactional way in this movie, but like they actually get together. I really like their storyline in Scream 2. I might watch Scream 2 tonight. We'll see. But
I might as well, so yeah.
Josh really likes, there's a special Gale and Dewey music cue that throughout the series they lean on. And
it's like a xylophone, like a bell thing, but it sounds really sweet. And like every time I watch, I always like think that it's in Scream 1, and it's not. Because I think of that as like Gale and Dewey's theme. It probably is called that, but yeah. But in Scream 2 in particular, it plays like 3-4 times, and I really like it. It's good stuff.
I'll look out for it.
Any final thoughts on Scream? Scram 1. Good movie. That's my final thought.
Good movie.
Yeah.
Final thought.
Very good movie.
Favorite horror movie, actually. It's my favorite horror movie by far. Yeah, love it.
Yeah, it's a wonderful movie, and if anyone is listening to this that hasn't seen the movie, sorry for spoiling it, and please watch it and give the subsequent ones a chance because you will not regret it. They are a true delight.
Y'all have convinced me. I'm going to watch the rest of the Scream movies.
Woo! So again, my take is Scream 3 is the lesser one. Katie's take is Scream 4 is the lesser one.
We'll see.
That's the take in the house.
I guess we'll report back.
We'll get back to you guys.
Please do. Please do. We can make this a Scream podcast. I'll be back for Scream 2 next week.
There is a podcast that exists that their episodes are a minute-by-minute breakdown of the movie Heat. And so every episode of the podcast is discussing 1 minute of Heat.
Actually,
we can do that about Scream.
Wow.
Scream franchise.
There is a website that is called The Movie Minute, where they collect all of the podcasts that do 1 movie a minute. Well, they do 1 episode a minute, and there's like 100 of them. And I may or may not have listened to The Matrix Minute. Let's say.
You got a problem. But I would probably do that for a few movies. A few movies we've discussed in this podcast, I would listen to a minute-by-minute breakdown. Or I could probably talk to a minute-by-minute breakdown. Have me on as a guest for this podcast.
Can I offer up a Scream drinking game for anyone if they want to partake in it? So this is something that I personally have not played, but we noticed there was a group of women behind us when we saw it the summer at an outdoor cemetery. And they were drinking every time someone called Sydney Sid, which, spoiler alert, that's going to happen all the dang time. They were drinking a bunch of other things, but this one was one of my favorites. Every time they say cellular, spoiler alert, that happens a lot more than you think it does. And that's one of the few things that really kind of dates the movie. It's funny. They ask Billy at some point, son, what are you doing with a cellular phone? And I'm like, oh my gosh. Well,
we'll be able to trace his cellular.
Yep, and that's 1996 for you, but just really fun way to experience a really amazing movie.
Yeah, last thing I guess I want to mention is, I mentioned earlier, it doesn't really look dated or feel dated. The cellular references are probably the only thing that make it feel dated for me, but also, like, the women's fashion in this is totally back right now. Like, again, I was watching this with Katie and another young woman that we're friends with, and like they were both like, "Yeah, I'd wear that. I'd wear that. I'd wear that." And I'm like, "Yeah, I see it."
The
male fashion less so. Male fashion less so, but female fashion in this movie.
Julia made fun of me, and she was like, "Oh, all the girls in this movie dress like you," and I was like, "Yeah, that's true." Take out the tank tops, pretty much.
Calling them cellular, yeah, that's dated, but also that every home has a landline is also very dated. Yeah. But honestly, I think this, because of the use of cellular phones, that kind of saves this movie from becoming too dated. Because they got in just at that point where cellular technology was something that a lot of people had, and then it only got more and more popular. So I think that if they weren't using cell phones, not only does the plot not work, but if they didn't have cell phones, this movie itself would become a lot harder to go back and watch and like fully grasp.
Sure. So, shall we rank it?
Yes, we should. We do have to ask you for your ranking on Her Majesty's Secret Service as well, though.
If you watched it.
I'd be happy to give you that ranking once I watch On Her Majesty's Secret Service.
Well, that'll
Stay
remain
tuned.
pending, I guess.
Okay, yeah, I see that on the outline. You guys didn't hammer down where you're.
No, we have it at 25 based on our average, but whenever you join, we'll move it.
Okay, so I'm looking at the ranking for where to put Scream. Katie, for the record, we rank every movie that we watch on the podcast, and like it's pretty top heavy right now because we've watched some of the best movies of all time. So like, I don't know, like it's
she's already bracing herself. Like, this is going to be a fight later, man.
It's very hard to rank because this ranking we have is not my personal ranking. So like, there are some things that are higher that I think should be lower and that kind of thing. So like, if I come from the top down, I could put it at like, I don't know, number 8 because I like it more than Lawrence of Arabia. But if I come from the bottom up, it probably ends up at 14 because I don't like it as much as Chinatown. I think I've been going bottom up, so I'll say 14 between Chinatown and Your Name is my rank.
We talked about this on last week, where like like whenever I go to do my ranking, I always like jump to the middle, and or I do one of two things. I either jump to the middle and then look around there, like where do I go up or down from here, or if I know that I like the movie better than what I consider our bottom tier of movies, I go there and I work my way up. I definitely like this better than Matrix Reloaded, so we already have to start above that, because that's the bottom tier for me. But for me, I put it at what would be number 17, just under John Wick and above Network.
I don't get how you don't like Network, but okay. Hugo, about you.
I'm playing the list a little bit, to be honest, because obviously this is not my list, again, as Josh was saying. So I would also put it below John Wick, above Network. I maybe would not rank this above Network if it was higher on the list, but looking at this is the way that it is, I would definitely put it below John Wick, above Network.
I also want to point out that every time we talk about this list, you guys say, this 17. Isn't my list. And no, it's not your list. Say it. It's our list.
I'm explaining to my wife why I'm not putting Scream in my top 10. Mm-hmm. I'm just trying to put that out there.
I'm getting my feelings hurt over here about how low you guys are ranking it. Just breathing heavily into my microphone.
I feel like on my personal list, it might end up around 10 or 11.
Don't act like you guys aren't a part of this list, okay?
I participate in this whole exercise under protest, and you know this. You know this. Okay, so I guess I have it at 14. You guys both have it at 17. Based on my math, for which I went to school for, that puts it at number 16. So ahead of John Wick?
Just ahead of John Wick.
Behind Wind Rises? All right,
yes.
16. For now, because when we re-rank this list, you better believe that Scream's going up on mine.
It could be dramatically transformed when we actually average out our rankings.
And also, I'd be curious to know if your estimation of Scream changes once you watch 2, 3, and 4. Personally,
could be,
because I think it'll go up.
Well, go ahead and give them our top 15 so that people know what's ahead of it.
Good call. Okay, so top 15, starting with number 1, we have Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Dr. Strangelove, The Silence of the Lambs, Paddington 2, Shaun of the Dead, Boogie Nights, The Departed, Lawrence of Arabia, Mulholland Drive, The Thing, Citizen Kane, It's a Wonderful Life, Chinatown, Your Name, The Wind Rises, and Scram. Scram, number 16.
So there's a lot of really good movies ahead of there on the list, but I do think that Josh is kind of right when we actually do go do our re-ranking episodes.
Katie's face right now is like
that it'll be shifted around. I can imagine Scream might actually go up.
I hope so, because I love this movie. Let's wrap up. Grizz, where can we find you online?
You can find me on twitch.tv/goodgamegrizz, where we actually did stream this live for the first time ever, mostly as a means of us backing up our video for when things go tragically wrong with my internet. But you can also find me on Twitter at goodgamegrizz. Please locate me in both of those locations. Throw me a follow. I'd really appreciate it.
Hugo.
And you can find me at Hugo_Pinay on Twitter and Hugo Pinay on letterboxd. So yeah, that's it, really.
Katie, you want to shout out socials, or are you good?
Well, you can find me in real life, primarily, if you live in Los Angeles. On Instagram, I'm Katie. Yeah, don't come find me. I'm Katie.Bradley1. I don't post anything, but if you want to DM me about Scream, DMs are open. Hit me up.
And I am on Twitter at @TheSloopJoshB, new handle, just trying it out. And I'm on YouTube at Movies I Love, and so can you. And I'm working on something about the birdcage, so stay tuned for something about the birdcage.
It's gonna be
but it'll probably still be a while. It's taken me a long time to edit this thing, so. And that's it. Also, follow the podcast at RTF_pod. Do not follow at RTF pod or at RTF_podcast, because they are sworn enemies.
Yes.
At RTF_pod.
Thank you guys for having me. It's been a blast.
Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for stopping by, Katie.
That's awesome.
Maybe you'll actually listen to this episode because you're on it, and we can have you on again to discuss.
She lived it, Josh. She doesn't need to watch.
I do. I love it.
Are there any other movies that you would want to come on for, Katie? Before we break.
Yeah, there probably are. I need to probably sit and think about it. If you guys ever want to do a rom-com, I would do When Harry Met Sally. I think that's an excellent movie.
That is one of the
that is
classics.
actually esteemed, that I am very well versed in. A lot of 80s movies, a lot of rom-coms. So, yeah,
we should. Well, the thing is, like, part of the premise of the podcast is to give some love to movies we feel like don't just get enough love, and like Harry Met Sally gets a lot of love. So maybe The Wedding Singer. The Wedding Singer would be a good one.
Oh, have me back. I freaking love that. I will get on the Scream hill again, because Scream and The Wedding Singer have the same place in my heart. Incredible movies. Okay, I'll be back.
In the meantime, thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another exciting episode of Remember the Film. Wait, what are we talking about next week? Do we have a movie for next week yet?
We don't have one for next weekend. We have one.
All right.
Are we doing a podcast?
Tune into our Twitter account. Tune into our Twitter account and we'll announce next week, and we'll see you next time. Bye.